The letter was taped to my front door like a warning. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper flapping in the morning breeze. Urgent. Mold contamination report, immediate action required. My stomach dropped when I saw the HOA letterhead. I already knew who was behind it before I read a single word. Sabrina Vexley, president of our HOA and self-proclaimed neighborhood health advocate. She was the type of woman who wore a whistle around her neck at all times like she was waiting to referee a yard violation. Mid-50s, frosted bob, and a voice like a car alarm. And she absolutely hated me. I wasn't her kind of neighbor. I didn't attend her monthly compliance coffee chats, I didn't repaint my mailbox every spring, and I definitely didn't let her tell me how to trim my hedges. I was just a guy named Isaac Trenner who bought a house with a solid foundation and a decent backyard. But Sabrina? She treated this block like her personal kingdom. The letter accused me of harboring dangerously high levels of toxic black mold and cited a professional inspection ordered by the HOA. It claimed the spores were spreading into neighboring properties, and if I didn't vacate my home within 30 days for remediation, I'd be fined $10,000 and face further legal consequences. Legal consequences? I muttered, flipping the page. At the bottom was a signature from some supposed environmental specialist I'd never heard of. No business license, no contact number, not even a company logo. It looked like it was printed off a template online. I walked straight to the edge of my lawn where Sabrina happened to be pruning her roses like she was auditioning for a gardening competition. She didn't even glance up. "Sabrina," I called. "You want to explain this?" Her eyes sparkled with fake concern. "Isaac, it's not personal. The board received anonymous complaints. We had to act. Mold is a serious issue." "An anonymous complaint? From who?" "Your reflection." She pressed her lips together. "I'm just doing my job. The safety of this community is my first priority. No inspection ever took place, Sabrina. I have a Ring camera. No one's come near my house in weeks." She blinked just once, then turned back to her roses. "Well, maybe they inspected from a distance, right? Because mold spores can be seen from across the street with binoculars and a clipboard." That night, I called in a real environmental inspection team, certified, licensed, and listed with the state. 2 guys showed up the next morning and spent over 3 hours going through my attic, HVAC system, crawl space, and walls. "No mold," the lead inspector said plainly. "Not even mildew. Your house is clean." He handed me the report with photos, signatures, and documentation stamped with the state seal. I knew what I had to do next. I called a friend of mine, Shannon Velridge, a real estate lawyer I went to college with. She met me at my kitchen table the following morning, coffee in hand, eyes already scanning the fake HOA report. "Isaac," she said, flipping the page, "this is fraud. If they fabricated this document and used it to threaten legal or financial action, that's criminal." "Good," I said, "because I'm not just going to clear my name. I'm going to burn down their little paper throne legally." Shannon cracked her knuckles. "Then let's get to work." Shannon didn't waste time. By noon, she'd filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Consumer Protection, attaching the real inspection report, the fake one from the HOA, and a notarized affidavit from me detailing the timeline. She also flagged the forged inspector's signature. But she wasn't finished. "This isn't just a civil matter," she said, dialing from her car as I walked beside her. "They created a fraudulent document and used it to threaten eviction and heavy penalties. That's attempted extortion. I'm copying in the state attorney's office." I hadn't expected it to escalate that quickly. But Shannon was calm, methodical, like she'd done this dance before. By the end of the day, we had a case number and a detective. Detective Halloran, from the Financial Crimes Division, called me directly. His voice was clipped, efficient. He'd already read Shannon's submission and wanted to come by the next morning to collect the original documents and view the Ring footage. The next morning, Halloran arrived in a gray sedan. No lights, no uniform. He walked with a slight limp and carried a worn leather folder. As he stepped into my living room, he scanned the area like he was mentally cataloging everything. "You said the document was left on your door?" he asked, settling onto the couch. I handed him the forged report. He pulled a pair of thin gloves from his coat pocket and used tweezers to place it into a plastic sleeve from his folder. "I've seen this kind of thing before," he said. "HOAs getting creative with enforcement. But this is another level." He reviewed the ring footage next. Sabrina's husband, Gerald, the HOA treasurer, was clearly visible walking up my driveway at dawn, a folder in hand. He looked around once, then taped the document to my door and walked off. "The timestamp matches your statement," Halloran said. "No sign of a licensed inspector in any of your footage before or after?" "None," I said. "Not even a pest control guy?" He nodded once. "Good. That helps." The following Thursday, Halloran returned with a warrant. He hit 3 houses on our street: Sabrina's, Gerald's, and the home of a third board member, a wiry man named Vince who owned a landscaping business and liked to patrol the neighborhood on a motorized scooter. I watched from my kitchen window as officers carried out boxes of files, a desktop computer, and a thick accordion folder labeled Community Enforcement Actions. By the time the sun was setting, word had spread. Neighbors were out on their lawns, whispering in tight groups. Someone said they'd seen Gerald being questioned in his own garage. Another claimed Sabrina had tried to call her brother, a local zoning administrator, to pull strings, which only made the officers more curious. I stayed quiet. Shannon met me that night at the diner off Route 21, where we sat in a booth near the back. She'd just gotten off a call with Halloran. "They found a folder on Gerald's hard drive," she said, sliding her phone across the table. "Look." The screen showed a file tree labeled Mold Strategy 2024. Inside were templates of forged reports, a list of target addresses, and notes about upcoming property tax assessments. The plan, apparently, was to force select homeowners into voluntary remediation, then buy them out at a discount through a shell company registered under Vince's wife. "They were trying to flip homes," Shannon said, using fake violations to drive down value, then scooping them up before the next appraisal cycle. "And mine was the first test run?" She nodded. "You weren't supposed to push back. They figured you'd panic or leave." That night, I finally let myself feel something beyond frustration. I was furious. Not just for myself. Sabrina and her circle had turned our entire neighborhood into a chessboard. And the pieces? But it wasn't over yet. The next week, Halloran requested a town hall meeting. Officially, it was for community transparency during an ongoing investigation. Unofficially, it was a reckoning. I arrived early and sat in the third row of folding chairs at the community rec center. Neighbors trickled in, some whispering, some openly glaring at the empty seats at the front reserved for the HOA board. At exactly 7 o'clock, Halloran stepped up to the podium, flanked by a local prosecutor and a county investigator. He wasted no time. "We have sufficient evidence to charge 3 members of your HOA board with conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted extortion, and falsification of legal documents," he announced. Gasps rippled through the room. He lifted up a printout of the forged mold report. This document was not created by a licensed inspector. It was generated in a Word template found on a seized computer belonging to Gerald Vexley. Another murmur. A woman 2 rows ahead of me raised her hand. "What happens now?" she asked. The prosecutor stepped forward. "The individuals involved are being arraigned this week. In the meantime, the HOA's authority to issue fines or enforcement notices is suspended until a temporary administrator is appointed." A man near the back stood up. "So they can't harass us about grass height or mailbox paint anymore?" "Not until further notice," the prosecutor confirmed. Someone laughed. The rest of the room followed. After the meeting, a few neighbors came over to shake my hand. A retired firefighter named Don told me he'd received a similar mold warning last year but hadn't known how to challenge it. A younger couple on the next block said they'd been cited for excessive shade coverage and fined for not thinning out their mature oaks. It all started to make sense. This wasn't just about me. It was a pattern, a racket dressed up as community guidelines. 2 days later, a judge ordered Sabrina, Gerald, and Vince to stay away from HOA operations pending trial. Their assets were frozen. Their personal properties were being reviewed for suspicious acquisitions. Shannon and I, meanwhile, met with a different group, the city's Department of Neighborhood Affairs. They'd received enough complaints in the past week to justify a full audit of the HOA's past 5 years of financial records. And guess who they wanted to help them untangle the mess? I'm not an accountant, I told them. No, the head of the department said. But you kept records. You installed security cameras. You stood your ground. That's the kind of person we need on the interim advisory board. I didn't say yes. Not right away. But as I walked out of the municipal building and glanced back at the seal on the doorway, I realized something. Sabrina had tried to use fear and fake authority to scare us into submission. Now we had the truth and the law on our side. And for once, the HOA wasn't the one holding the clipboard. 2 weeks after the town hall, my street felt different. The usual quiet had taken on a charged stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm. Sabrina's house sat dark most evenings now, blinds drawn tight, her prize rose bushes starting to wilt from neglect. Gerald's truck hadn't moved in days. Vince's scooter lay abandoned in his side yard, half covered by a tarp that flapped in the wind. Nobody missed them, but the wreckage they left behind was still being sifted through. Every other day, someone from the city oversight committee stopped by asking questions, reviewing HOA payment records, or collecting statements from neighbors. I'd been interviewed twice already, and each time they uncovered something worse, like the shell company Vince had set up under his cousin's name. It had purchased 4 properties on the block in the last 18 months, all at prices well below market value. Each of those sales had followed suspicious HOA citations. One homeowner, a single mother named Marlene, had moved out after being told her home's foundation was irreparably compromised. She'd sold in a panic. Turns out the only thing compromised was the report typed up by the same fake inspector Sabrina had used on me. When I stopped by Marlene's new apartment across town to let her know what had come to light, she leaned against her doorway, arms folded. I knew something was off, she said. But they kept sending these notices, and then Gerald showed up talking about buyer interest and how I could avoid big fines if I just sold quickly. I had my kids to think about. I nodded. They targeted people who couldn't push back. They didn't think people like you would. That stuck with me. By the end of the month, the city appointed a temporary administrator, a no-nonsense civil planning officer named Denise Morrow. She didn't care about hedge height or mailbox colors. Her first act was to freeze all HOA accounts and order a full third-party audit. Her second was more surprising. She asked me to join the oversight panel she was forming with 5 other residents. I work at a fabrication plant, I told her. I'm not a policy guy. She waved that off. You documented everything. You didn't fold. We need eyes like that. I agreed, but only after she promised every meeting would be open to the public and recorded. The first panel session drew a larger crowd than expected. We met in the high school auditorium, more space, more chairs. Denise stood at the front, beneath a whiteboard that already had 4 categories written across it: financial irregularities, property manipulation, board misconduct, and external influence. The last one caught my attention. As we got into the meeting, it became clear why it was there. One of the auditors had discovered a series of transactions between the HOA's main account and a privately managed consulting group in the next county. Payments had been logged as compliance advisory services, but no services had ever been rendered. The group, called Greystone Neighborhood Solutions, didn't have an office. It had a P.O. box, one listed phone number that went straight to voicemail, and a website filled with vague language about property optimization. A week later, Detective Halloran confirmed what we suspected: Greystone was a front. It had been incorporated by a man named Lyle Hammond, a disbarred attorney connected to a real estate syndicate flagged by the state 5 years ago. And now things were officially bigger than just our street. The state attorney's office got involved, expanding the investigation to include Greystone and its links to other HOA boards across the region. Apparently, our neighborhood wasn't the only one that had experienced sudden mold emergencies, suspicious citations, and pressure to sell. Meanwhile, Gerald had finally lawyered up. His attorney tried arguing that the documents were misunderstood administrative drafts and that no actual enforcement had occurred. But Shannon had already forwarded the original threats, including the one taped to my door, to the prosecution. The claim that it was a draft doesn't hold up, Shannon told me over lunch one afternoon. Especially when those drafts were used to push people into selling their homes. What's their endgame? I asked. Why risk jail time over a few houses? She raised an eyebrow. Not a few. They were trying to create a pocket of undervalued properties to flip before the next zoning shift. The city's development plans leaked last year. This area is about to become prime real estate. So that was it. They weren't enforcing order. They were laying groundwork for profit. And they were willing to fabricate, coerce, and ruin lives to do it. The trial date was set for early fall. Sabrina, Gerald, and Vince were each facing multiple felony charges. But while the legal system moved forward, we still had to clean up what they'd left behind. The audit revealed nearly $40,000 in unexplained withdrawals from the HOA's reserve fund. That money was supposed to cover emergency repairs, winter storm cleanup, things that actually mattered. Instead, it had gone toward advisory fees, compliance assistance, and thousands in catering for closed-door strategy meetings. No one knew what those meetings were about. No one had ever been invited to them. Denise brought in a forensic accountant who traced several of the withdrawals to prepaid debit cards registered under aliases. One of them had been used to buy a printer, the same model used to create the forged mold reports. It was all falling into place. Around that time, I started getting more involved with neighbors. People who barely spoke to each other before were now exchanging documents, reviewing policies, and volunteering ideas. One guy, Tomas, had experience in urban zoning law and offered to draft a new set of HOA bylaws with real checks and balances. We were going to hold elections for a completely new board. No one from the old guard could run. That was unanimous. Still, not everyone was thrilled. A few quiet supporters of the previous board tried to argue that Sabrina had kept things orderly and that the neighborhood had looked better under her rule. But those voices grew fewer each week, especially as more stories came out. Like how Vince had sent a warning letter to a widow across the street for unauthorized driveway usage because her adult son had parked there during a visit. Or how Gerald had tried to fine a retired teacher for using a mobility ramp that interfered with visual symmetry. Those weren't rules. They were weapons. By midsummer, the neighborhood looked rougher. Sure, some lawns weren't perfectly edged. A few fences needed staining. But no one cared. There was laughter at block parties again, and people left their porch lights on during late strolls. For the first time, the place felt like a neighborhood instead of a gated fiefdom. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, Denise walked over with a clipboard. "We're finalizing the new charter," she said. "Want to see the section on board accountability?" I nodded. She handed it over. The clause was crystal clear. Any board member found to have violated state or municipal law while serving would be permanently barred from holding any HOA position in the county. "Not just our neighborhood, all of it. They'll never be able to pull this again," she said. "And if someone tries?" She smiled. "We'll be ready." I looked across the street where kids were chalking the sidewalk with dragons and outer space scenes. Somewhere down the block, someone had set up a grill and music drifted through the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was ours. No fake reports. No threats. No one standing by with a clipboard and a forced smile waiting to pounce on a technicality. Just neighbors. And a promise that next time we'd see the storm coming and we'd stand together through it. 2 weeks before the trial, I got a call from Detective Halloran just after 7 in the morning. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need you to come down to the precinct," he said. "There's been a development. It's about Greystone." By the time I arrived, the conference room had 2 new faces, a federal investigator from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and a forensic data analyst. A laptop sat open on the table, paused on a screen of thousands of financial transactions stacked in a spreadsheet. Halloran gestured to the seat across from him. "You're going to want to hear this." The analyst clicked to another tab. We pulled metadata from the hard drives seized from Vince's home. Turns out there's a shared drive that connected to an encrypted server. Took us a while to break into it. He clicked again, and a folder tree unfolded like a blueprint of corruption. Dozens of neighborhood names, each with subfolders labeled acquisition strategy, risk assessment, and compliance pathing. They weren't just targeting your HOA, the HUD investigator said. They'd built a system. Greystone was feeding these boards templates, legal-sounding citations, forged inspection reports, everything they needed to manufacture violations. In exchange, Greystone got a cut of every property sold under pressure. I leaned forward. How many neighborhoods? The analyst answered without looking up. 34 across the state. 11 with active cases already. Yours was the only one that pushed back early enough to prevent a full sweep. Halloran handed me a copy of the file labeled Hollow Pines Strategy. That was our neighborhood. At the top there was a timeline. My address was listed first, marked as a pilot test for forced remediation. They hadn't just picked me at random, they'd planned it. They scheduled my mold report 3 weeks before it even showed up, I said, flipping through the pages. They never intended to stop with me. The HUD investigator nodded. They built this to scale. The goal wasn't just to flip houses, it was to create controlled valuation drops, then flood the market with silent buyers just before rezoning announcements. I looked up. You're saying they were manipulating city planning timelines? Some of the zoning maps were accessed before they were made public, he said. We're looking into who leaked them. It's not just board members anymore, we're dealing with a full-blown conspiracy. By the end of the meeting, the case had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined. Sabrina, Gerald, and Vince were now being named as key witnesses in a broader probe. Their plea deals would depend on how much they cooperated. That night, I met with Denise and the rest of the interim oversight panel in the back room of the library. Word had already spread, and the mood was tense. We need to tell the rest of the neighborhood, said Tomas, the zoning expert. People deserve to know how close we came to being gutted. We will, Denise said, standing. But let's be smart about it. A community forum, not another town hall. Something open, informal. Let people ask questions. We should invite the HUD rep, I added. And Halloran. Let them hear from the people they helped. 2 days later, we held the forum in the local park under the shade of the old oaks. No stage, no microphones, just folding chairs, coolers of lemonade, and a projector screen rigged up to the side of the rec center. Over 70 people showed. The HUD investigator explained the scope of the scam, walking through their findings with patience and clarity. He didn't sugarcoat anything. They chose your neighborhood because it had the right demographic spread, stable incomes, high homeownership rates, and low litigation history. They assumed you'd comply out of habit. A woman in the back raised her hand. How did none of this get caught sooner? Halloran stepped forward. Because it was designed to look legitimate. Everything had enough legal language to pass a quick glance. And until someone challenged it with evidence, there was no reason to dig deeper. I looked around and saw heads nodding. People weren't angry, they were determined. Afterward, neighbors came up to me with questions, ideas, and in one case, a binder of documentation from past HOA meetings that had gone ignored for years. A retired librarian named Cynthia had kept every newsletter, citation, and board memo since moving in. She handed it over like passing the torch. I think it's time this neighborhood had real records, she said. Not just threats passed under doors. The trial began the following Monday. The courtroom wasn't packed, but every seat on our side of the gallery was filled. Sabrina sat stiffly in a navy blazer, her hair no longer frosted but dyed a severe black. Gerald looked drained, his face pale and hands clasped. Vince didn't look up once. The prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision. Documents, emails, bank records, and testimony from experts built a damning picture of calculated fraud. But the most powerful moment came when Marlene, the single mother who'd been driven out by the fake structural report, took the stand. They told me my home was unsafe, she said, voice steady. Said I'd be liable if someone got hurt. I believed them. I didn't know it was all fake. The courtroom fell silent. Even the defense attorneys avoided eye contact. By the end of the second week, Sabrina's lawyer approached the bench with a plea deal. She would testify against Greystone's founders and provide access to every communication she'd received from them. In exchange, she'd serve 18 months in a minimum security facility and pay restitution to affected homeowners. Gerald followed suit, agreeing to a 5-year probation and a lifetime ban from serving on any housing board. Vince, however, refused. He insisted he'd been manipulated. The judge didn't buy it. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. The fallout was immediate. Greystone's assets were frozen. The state launched a task force to audit every HOA tied to the scheme. A new bill was introduced in the state legislature requiring mandatory third-party oversight for all nonprofit housing associations over a certain size. And Hollow Pines? We rebuilt. The new board was elected with full transparency. Every meeting was streamed online. Every decision was voted on publicly. No more closed-door sessions. No more anonymous citations. We established a neighborhood fund not for fines, but for actual improvements, sidewalk repairs, community gardens, tree maintenance. People started volunteering for cleanup days, coordinating childcare swaps, even organizing weekend classes on home maintenance and budgeting. One evening, a kid down the street rolled by on his bike and called out, "Hey, Mr. Trenner, my dad says the HOA doesn't suck anymore." I laughed. "Tell him we're trying real hard." Later that year, the city awarded Hollow Pines a civic improvement grant. We used it to build a small community pavilion in the park, picnic tables, a tool shed, and a free library stand that Cynthia managed personally. And every time I passed it, I remembered that it started with a fake mold report and a door-taped warning meant to scare me out of my home. Instead, it became the thing that brought the neighborhood back to life. No more fear. No more manipulation, just people finally in control of where they live.